Hello, and welcome to the Creative Career Change podcast with me, Hannah Ash. I make my living working simultaneously as a music teacher, an interior designer, a writer, a podcaster, and more. You can read more about me and my work on Substack. Visit shayhanny.substack.com. That's Shayhanny spelled Chezhanny. The focus of this series is on female multi-hyphenates. I've been interested in this concept ever since I read Emma Gannon's book, The Multi-Hyphen Method, several years ago, and these days I consider myself to be a multi-hyphenate. I'm keen to explore, through talking to other women, what real-life multi-hyphenate life looks like across the world, the joys, the challenges, and everything in between. Today I'm joined by Lucy Pearson, who is the very definition of a creative multi-hyphenate. Books and words are central to everything Lucy does. Let's find out more. Lucy, welcome to the Creative Career Change podcast, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today. Please could you introduce yourself and explain what you do for a job now in 2024?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me on. I'm Lucy and I do a few different things. So I am a freelance writer. I curate libraries for hotels, Airbnbs and homes. And I also work as a bibliotherapist and a literary salon host.
Amazing. And could you explain to us how you found yourself in all of these different roles and situations, and take us through the career journey that you've had in order to get here?
I did my degree in double English, and I sort of graduated mid-recession in 2009, and I couldn't get a job in publishing for love nor money. I did internship after internship after internship, and I think after about a year of interning, my parents were like, you need to get a job, whether it's in publishing or not. And because I had mainly been interning in the publicity department of publishing companies, and I also did an internship at an arts PR agency, it was quite a natural progression for me to sort of segue into PR. I ended up working in beauty PR, it was a really fun sort of job, but it definitely wasn't where my passion lied. And my boss at the time, Edwina, she knew that I had really wanted to work in books. And so this was sort of, I mean, it's wild to think of it now because so many people blog. But this was sort of when blogging was very much in its infancy. And she told me, if you ever want to work with books, you need to start a book blog. So I started a book blog. It used to be called The Unlikely Bookworm, which is a bit cringe now, but at the time, it sort of felt like it suited me. And I then decided to read my way through. The BBC had released a list of the top 100 books. So the nation has sort of voted for their favourite books. I decided to read my way through the top 100, and my blog was sort of a way to record what I felt about each book. I then went from there. I got a job working for the Women's Prize for Fiction, heading up their social media. So it sort of felt like all the interning and all the sort of blood, sweat and tears I'd poured into my blog had paid off, because they sort of said it was mainly off the back of my blog that they hired me. Worked for them for a couple of years. I then moved to Australia for a boy who dumped me almost as soon as I got here.
Oh, no.
And subsequently have sort of been freelance and working for myself ever since. The writing came about, sort of my freelance writing career came about off the back of my blog, because as well as doing book reviews, I also reviewed literary hotels. I wrote about bookshops that I loved. So that sort of lent itself quite well to my freelance writing career. I won an award for my blog a few years ago, after which the bookshop near me in Bondi, where I live, they approached me about launching a book club. So I co-founded the Bondi Literary Salon with them, which I host. Um, the library curation part of things came quite randomly. I now do a bit of freelance travel journalism, and it came off the back of a hotel basically asking me to curate a library for them. And the bibliotherapy sessions I launched during lockdown, which is essentially, for anyone that doesn't know what bibliotherapy is, it's the sort of therapeutic practice of using books for healing. So more and more people were coming to me via my Instagram and via the book club asking for book recommendations. And so I launched bibliotherapy sessions, which is essentially, it can be anything from someone might come to me and say, I'm going through heartbreak, I've just broken up with my partner. What would you recommend I read? That's sort of the more therapeutic side of things. Or it can be anything as straightforward as, I want to find more time to read. I've never read a classic. I want to diversify my bookshelf. So it could be both just a pain point in reading that someone has, or something that they need books to sort of help them through. But to caveat that, I am by no means a therapist. It is a practice that can be used in therapeutic settings, but it would be a bit like the blind leading the blind if I were to say that I was doing it. But I'm definitely not a therapist, but I am someone who's an expert in books.
There were two things here that I think really piqued my attention when you sent me through some information about your background and your career before. They're both on the same theme, actually, which is this idea of doing something and not quite knowing what the consequences might be, but then further down the line, it paying off. And I think that's a really good lesson to all of us in lots of ways, that you mentioned just then about your boss when you were working for the beauty PR company recommending that you started a book blog, which you did. And obviously that was following a passion of yours, but also a lead from somebody who probably knew what they were talking about in terms of where that might go. And lo and behold, it led to a job that was the sort of job that you really wanted. And I love the sound of your blog as well. I'd be quite interested. Does it still exist?
Yes, so it does still exist. That's sort of the story of my life. I mean, hence moving to Australia for a man I knew for 6 days. I'm very impulsive person. I'm very spontaneous. If an opportunity arises, I tend to sort of grab it. I think that for lots of us working in creative fields, happenstance, contacts, random meetings can lead to things that we never could never anticipate. I presume the other thing that you were potentially going to mention was also how the library curation
Yes,
came.
it was.
I mean, I mentioned it came from a hotel, but what actually happened was I was writing, and I have to caveat this because it just sounds so bougie. I was on a sleep retreat in Italy with my mum. I was writing about it for the Telegraph, and we were incredibly fortunate. Sometimes when you go on press trips, you are allowed to take a +1. And they allowed me to bring my mum, and it was 7 days in the Italian sunshine. It was a sleep retreat, but they also had a vineyard. So there was no sort of, we weren't put under a really strict diet. There was champagne at breakfast, there was organic wine and cocktails at dinner. So it was just a dream week. And they also gave my mum some treatments, which I thought was incredibly generous of them. We had sort of worried that at the end we might have a bill for a couple of €1,000 because we knew that she was coming with me as a +1, but we weren't sure the exact scope. And we basically went to check out, and they said, the whole thing's on the house. You don't owe us a penny.
Wow.
And they had a library there, but so it was in the Dolomites. So most of their customers or guests were either German or Italian. So most of the books were in German or Italian. And as a book blogger, I often get sent a lot of books to review. So I had gone back to my mum's with her. My parents are in the UK, I'm in Australia. And I just packed up a box of new books that I had been sent that were sort of, in the sort of wellness genre that I thought their guests would like. I sent them a box of books and just said, thank you so much for such a wonderful week. It was just such a treat. And I sort of sent it off and never, ever thought about it again. And then 8 months later, the sort of the director of the spa, who's also a spa consultant, she's sort of an award-winning, absolute gun in her field. Sorry, gun is an Australian expression. It just means someone who's brilliant in her field. I suddenly thought that's not an English expression, it's Australian. She's brilliant at what she does, and she is brought in by other wellness retreats and spas all over the world to design the spa. And she came to me and said, I'm overseeing the opening of a women's only wellness hub in Abu Dhabi. Would you like to curate a list of books for us? And I sort of thought, well, yeah, of course, I can just send you a list. Like, how many do you want? And she sort of was like, no, like a paid job. And I thought, what do you mean? Like, you want to pay me to send you a list of books? And I mean, she did. And I sort of devised a couple of different offerings with the help of a friend of mine who's got a much better business brain than me. So I ended up sourcing the books, getting signed books, branding all the books, getting really beautiful like bookmarks. And that was sort of the start of my library curation service. But yeah, both times, I think with starting the book blog and with sending them the books as a thank you, there was certainly no ulterior motive or tactics or even sort of intention involved in my doing that. It came from a place of a deep love of books. But as you said, like both things really went on to completely change my life and my career trajectory.
Yeah, and I think it's about having or being passionate about something and doing it because it feels right for you at the time. You sent that box of books because you were so grateful that you and your mum had had this brilliant experience, and you'd probably also spotted, you spotted a kind of a gap there. And it's funny because I was talking to my sister after because you got in touch with me, which I loved the fact that you sent me an email saying that you were interested in being on the podcast, and you explained some of the stuff that you were doing. And I was telling my sister about this a couple of months ago, and I was explaining to her what you do as a bibliotherapist and the fact that you go and work with hotels and Airbnbs and places like that. And she said to me, oh my God, that's such a good idea. Because we both, in our sort of fairly small experience of going to hotels or going to Airbnbs, have experienced exactly what you described, which is where you go there and you're like, oh, there's not really anything decent to read, or it's like 2 or 3 books that the previous people have left behind, or
Exactly that. And I think it's really interesting because now I offer it as a service. I'm so much more aware of that. I've always been aware of it because, I mean, I'm a massive, massive reader, so I will never travel anywhere without at least 2 books on me. But I know that not everyone does that. And now that I'm more aware of it, and I'm very lucky through my work that I do get to stay in some very expensive hotels. And I was in one sort of 6 months ago, and it was about £1,000 a night. And everything was perfect. Like it was sort of a lodge. So there was a kitchen, beautiful crockery, sort of handmade pottery mugs, everything, French linen, Aesop products in the bathroom. Everything was perfect. And there was sort of a big shelf or in the kitchen. And it just had like 5 orange Penguin classics. And I was like, you've got a huge shelf and you either need to fill it or I was like, people are paying £1,000 and they had a horrible bright purple sticker with the hotel's logo. And I just thought it would have cost them maybe £300 to fill the shelf. And now that I'm doing it, and I have started, I've worked on some really amazing projects with Airbnbs and hotels, and no one sort of knows it is a something that exists. Everyone knows about sort of architects and interior designers and head of spas and everything. But I think it is a niche. And I'm certainly not the only person doing it, but I might be the only person doing it in Australia. Everyone that hears about it, and especially people that are interested in books, are sort of like, oh God, that makes sense. Because in the same way that you're an interior designer and you've got an eye for style and you know where to source materials or lamps or paint colors that other people might not, it's not as straightforward when you design a room as you going to Zara Home and picking stuff up, in the same way that I won't just go to Waterstones or the Australian equivalent. I go to secondhand bookshops. I go to street libraries. So it's an interesting, it's something that's born of a passion, which is,
Yeah.
I think, a sweet spot for creatives. If you're doing something that you're passionate about, that's sort of, without sounding too cheesy, that's sort of where the magic happens.
It was discovered by accident, like you say, by happenstance. And I think,
The accident.
yeah, that's just so nice. And I'm also really interested in the point that you made earlier, where you said that when you did go or when you did work on that spa project in Abu Dhabi, that you were doing things. It wasn't just you weren't just sourcing some books. Like, you didn't just go online on Amazon and go, okay, order
Yeah.
this and this. You said, I sourced signed copies of particular books, or really beautiful bookmarks, and it's that thinking about everything that surrounds the holistic experience of reading, isn't it? And not just, oh, here's a book.
Yeah.
There can be more to it than that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that is the thing, when you are sort of, when you're in your field and you know what you're talking about, we all know the sort of big five publishers, the Penguin, the HarperCollins, et cetera, but there are so many amazing independent publishers. Like Daunt Books has a publishing arm called Daunt Book Publishing. There's it's sort of fairly new, but I mean, it's all over Instagram. It's called Fitzcarraldo Editions, and everyone would have seen, they have either a bright blue cover or a white cover. They're sort of everywhere at the moment. They're based in Southeast London, and they do a lot of translated fiction. There's Europa Editions, who do, they've translated Natalia Ginsburg. There's Aselin for coffee table books. There are so many more books than just the ones that we might see sort of either on Instagram or in, the Times weekend magazine or something. And it's, for example, there was one book that I worked on a project in Tasmania recently, and it was an Airbnb on the water. And a lot of the books were in quite, not bad condition, but they were clearly, they were secondhand. One of them was a book called A Gift from the Sea by Anne. I can't remember her surname, so I'm not going to bastardize her name on this, but it's by Anne something. And it was the most beautiful edition. It almost had like a mermaid on the front, but it was it was a sort of hardback, and the cover was sort of peeling back, but it added to this nature of it being a book about women in the water in a sort of rustic Airbnb in Tasmania. Whereas I think most people might think, oh, I'll just, go to Waterstones or go online and order 20 brand new books. They don't have the character that I want to create in a library.
Yeah, and it so much depends on the location of that library, and the setting, the people that are going to go and be reading it. You've really got me thinking about this, because I'm thinking it even comes down to things like the sort of chair or sofa or whatever it is that you're going to sit in to read, if you're sitting outside and there's an amazing view, what kind of. So I can see there's so much to consider.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's interesting because I've actually sort of working with a couple of interior designers at the moment, because there is so much in common in terms of when you first look at a room and you think, how am I going to build it from the down up, like what do I want the feeling to be? What do I want the vibe to be? What's the location? What's the story about the people living here? That's everything that I think about before I buy books for a place. So there's a lot of, I'm sort of doing a course at the moment in styling, and there's a lot of sort of crossover in terms of, because you also want the books to look nice. So often I'm having to sort of think, okay, that there's a content, there's sort of the idea of content, like what do they want, what does the, you know, Airbnb owner or the owner of the house want them to sort of be about, but also what do they want to look like?
Yeah. And I'm also thinking, as you're talking, that the service that you're providing is not necessarily a one-off service for each place either. I can see that there's a necessity for it to be updated every few years because there might be some new releases or things that you come across that are more suitable. So there's that longevity in your business as well, which is a
Yeah,
really great
yeah,
thing.
absolutely. The idea of sort of doing a refresh after a year, just especially, you know, I'm certainly guilty of taking a book or two, you know, I'm
Me
in a
too.
hotel and there's a library. And with the more sort of spa and wellness destinations. So for example, the place I did in Abu Dhabi, we're actually now doing, so I did their library for them, and I'm now sort of doing a bibliotherapy campaign where each guest, when they arrive, they sort of have a sort of health and wellness test done, and it shows which chakras are blocked and etc etc etc. So I'm now doing a project with them where, depending on what test results they get, so it's something they also are told whether they need to focus on their spiritual, physical or emotional health. I'm doing a book prescription, so if you need to focus on your spiritual health, this is the book from the library that you should read. So there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination in what I do. And especially because a lot of the clients I work with, I'm in contact with them in my as a freelance journalist, because I might go and review you know, a spa or a hotel, and then I might say, "Oh, your library looks like it could do with a bit of a re." So there's a lot of sort of crossover in what I do, but it's I feel very, very lucky to have found a niche and a sweet spot that brings me so much joy.
And I love that two of your strands of work kind of cross over, but I'm sure there's even more that do. And that leads me nicely, I think, onto the next question. When did you first become aware of this term multi-hyphenate, and would you consider yourself to be one?
Yeah, so I think it was when Emma Gannon, I can't remember when she released her book, but she wrote a book called The Multi-Hyphen. And I feel like she may also have done a podcast of the same name, though I might be incorrect. But that was when I first became aware of it. And certainly for me, pretty much almost since I came to Australia, I never felt defined by the job I was sort of doing to earn money. So when I first moved here, I sort of did 6 months in one agency and 6 months in another, but they weren't anywhere near as sort of fulfilling for me as having worked on the Women's Prize for Fiction. And because my book blog, which I've sort of moved my book blog across to Substack, and I'm in the process of changing what the blog looks like, so it's sort of a static page with a link to my blog, because I haven't actually written a book review for about a year, but some of the content's being moved across, and some of the series I used to run, like I had a Desert Island book series where I'd interview authors about their favorite books. That's all moved across to Substack. But for so long, I felt far more defined by my blog than by whatever sort of agency I was freelancing for at the time. So for years, I sort of, if anyone said to me, "What do you do?" I always used to say, "I'm a book blogger." But then my passion for, not for writing, but just for blogging itself, I think it came to a point where everyone was sort of saying, "Oh, you know, you really need to focus on SEO." And I thought, well, I don't, I just want to write. So my passion for blogging has sort of been petering out over the past couple of years. And I, you know, so I was no longer felt as defined by calling myself a book blogger as I had previously. I sort of say, you know, I might just say, "Oh, I do a few things," or I say I'm a freelance writer, or I'll give them the whole mouthful and say I'm a bibliotherapist and a library curator and a writer. Sort of depends what the context is, how much time I have on my hands. and whether they look like they might be bored if I sort of spurt out 4 different occupations, which they may well. But yeah, so that was sort of my journey from book blogger. And I felt very defined by my job at the Women's Prize for Fiction because I was so passionate about what I did. But I think I haven't worked for another company since then who I've been passionate about. It's more like how do I personally identify with what I'm doing?
I hear this a lot, and I feel it myself as well, that sometimes if you meet somebody for the first time and they say, what do you do? It depends on so many factors, doesn't it, about what you might say. It's exactly what you've just told me. Sometimes I might say I'm a teacher just because that's really easy. Nobody really asks many more questions.
Yeah, if you don't want to end up in like a long conversation with someone, it's much easier to give them a one-word answer.
And then sometimes I might say I'm an interior designer. And sometimes, as you say, if the person seems quite receptive, you might actually say, I do lots of different things, and then go on to talk about them. But I suppose it's an interesting point because it got me thinking about whether we should really be worried about this or not. I mean, I don't think we should be. I don't think we should really care what other people think, but it does depend on the situation, doesn't it? And some people are incredibly confused by this concept of doing lots of different jobs, and I find that whole response quite fascinating, really.
Yeah, there are always going to be that people who, as you said, if you say a teacher, they don't have to do any sort of inner work on, oh, what does that mean? They know. Whereas, there are some people that if you say, oh, I do this and this, and they've only ever done the sort of, 9 to 5 career with a very linear trajectory, they might be confused, they might be dismissive, they might be a bit judgy, they might be a bit sort of, oh, that's not a proper job. I've had all of the above, but I've also had lots. I mean, on the whole, most people are very curious and intrigued and kind and, want to hear more about what I do. But, there's always going to be people on sort of both sides, aren't there?
Definitely. And I think actually there are more and more of us doing these kinds of wide-ranging or different strands to our work, and therefore it probably is becoming more normalized. And as time goes on, I see that it will become even more normalized because I think the younger generations are doing it straight away when they more so than perhaps my generation, and I think we're probably similar sort of age. And when I left university, it was kind of like, oh, well, what are you going to do now?
Freelancing would never have been an option, would it? I mean, so when did you graduate? Because I graduated in 2009.
Sorry, 2009, did you say?
Yeah.
I was 2006 for my undergrad degree. Yeah.
And I had taken a couple of gap years. So yeah, well, I'm sure we are about the same age.
I'm 39.
Yeah, I'm 38. Freelance would never have been an option for us straight out of university. It just wouldn't, working for yourself, doing more than one job, the onus was always on like you had to get a full-time job. There was no, there was no working from home. There was no wearing multiple hats. And I think it's good that there is now square pegs aren't being forced into round holes.
Definitely. I agree with that. Have your family and friends been supportive of all your different kind of career shifts along the way?
Unbelievably, I could not ask for better parents, better friends, a better boyfriend. My parents are divorced, but both my mum and my stepdad and my dad and my stepmom have been unwavering in their support, even when the financial implications have sort of meant I might have been a bit reliant on the bank of mum and dad while I've been, sort of figuring a few things out. They've been never has their sort of support for me been anything but complete and total. All my friends, out, especially because I'm in Australia and usually I'm writing for UK publications. When I got sort of a 6-page spread in the Telegraph for the aforementioned sleep retreat in Italy. All my friends were out like buying the Telegraph, huge supporters. And, my boyfriend, As much as I think he wishes I probably didn't travel as much with various sort of, whether it's travel writing or doing these library curation projects. I mean, I was just in Switzerland for sort of 6 days last week, and 2 weeks before that, I was in the UK for 3 weeks. He couldn't be more supportive. So I'm never not aware of what a huge privilege it has been and continues to be to have such support, because I know, especially in creative fields, that's not always the case.
So often, though, people want to see you be happy and be in your
Yeah,
comfort zone and be doing something that you're really passionate about. And I think, I mean, I can tell from talking to you that is evident, that you are clearly very passionate about what you do. And I suspect that your family and friends know that even more than I do,
of course.
So it makes sense. I'm going to ask you a question now about the finances of some of this. Do you make as much money now compared to when you were working in PR and social media in that more regular job that you had back in the UK? And does that matter?
I mean, I'm really sort of happy to be honest and open about figures and finances, because I think it's really important. I think especially as women, we often don't demand how much we should with this sort of thing. I was unbelievably lucky when I worked for the Women's Prize for Fiction. I'm happy to tell you my day rate if that.
If you're willing to, that I'm sure people would very much appreciate that, but it's up to you.
Absolutely. Um, so the funny thing was, this was 10 years ago, and I started on it. And so I was 27 when I started working. So it was 11 years ago. I was 27 when I started working for the Women's Prize for Fiction. What happened was, it was sponsored by Bailey's, who is owned by Diageo. So I was essentially working in a publishing role, but I was being paid by a corporate company. And back then I was on £150 a day, which was, I still see publishing jobs advertised for less than that. And then what happened is I went down, because £150, like, it's not to be sniffed at, but it's not anything major. What happened is I then went down to 3 days a week when we had a very clear calendar of how the prize operated. We announced the judges' announcement, the long list, the short list, and the winner. And I had gone down to 3 days a week, and my day rate basically went up to £250, which is almost unheard of for the amount of experience I had in publishing. But as I said, it was a very, very interesting, it was a sort of interesting role in that I was paid by a corporate company, whereas I know what salaries are like in publishing. So that was an incredibly good, I then went back up to 5 days a week. I was earning unbelievably good money for a 28, 29-year-old in London. And especially because I was a contractor. So I was then working 5 days a week. So I was sort of full-time freelance. Now, as I mean, most people who are freelance will tell you, especially because, for example, my library curation service has only been something I've been doing for sort of a year. My day rate can be up to £1,500 now, but the consistency is a lot less. So, I do an ambassadorship program with a couple of brands around reading. And, I sort of emceed an event for 3 hours and got paid £1,000 for that. But that might only happen 4 times a year. And I'm very comfortable and very open talking about money. I always, I'll tell people before they even ask, because I think there's so much fear around and not knowing how to price our services. My friend David, he was the one that told me exactly how much I should be charging for the library service in Abu Dhabi, because my initial thought was, I'll do this for free. Like, what? Like, this isn't a job. Like, of course I'll send you a list. And thankfully, I spoke to David about it, and he was like, it's the Middle East. You are not doing it for free. If you're going to charge some big bucks, that is where you're going to do it. To be completely honest, I don't actually know what my yearly income is. Like, I honestly, my finances are so all over the place, mainly because my boyfriend and I are going through a few visa issues in Australia at the moment. So
Right.
we're chucking everything we make at that. So I could be 50 grand off if I told you how much I made in dollars, not pounds. It's not sort of that much. So I don't really know what my yearly income is, but I know that my day rate has increased, but the consistency has decreased. So that's sort of where I sit financially.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And I think listeners will as well, because I agree with you that particularly as women, I think we do often undersell ourselves, and it can be so difficult, can't it, to pluck a figure out of the air as to what you think a service is worth.
Yeah.
And I think we do often go lower than we perhaps should. So I'm sure many people will appreciate that.
I think we pretty much as women always do. And I think I remember when I sort of sent the quote across to Abu Dhabi, and I thought I was sort of lying in the corner with a wet flannel and sort of smelling salt, because I thought I was going to faint, because I thought, I can't believe how much I've just asked for when, I'm just providing them with books. But my friend was like, no, you're providing them with a service and knowledge of books you've taken 10, 15 years to build. And I think, and I understand why people don't like talking about money. And I do get that, especially we're very English, it's a bit of a taboo subject. But I think only good can come from talking about money with fellow creatives, and especially fellow female creatives. Me keeping to myself how much I charge, if if someone came to me and said, oh, how much you charge, because I'll probably be a bit annoyed if someone wanted to do something similar to me, like in the library curation.
Yes,
But
of course. Yeah.
like in freelance journalism, there are some freelancers, people sort of slide into each other's DMs and say, oh, this is how much I've been offered from this. And some people would say, I actually got paid £50 more for the same amount of words. And some would say, I don't feel comfortable discussing this. And I do appreciate that. But I think pricing your services as a creative is unbelievably difficult, because you might get an interior designer who charges £100 a room, and you might get an interior designer that charges £100,000 a
Yeah.
room. And when you're new to it, how the hell are you supposed to figure that out on your own? I think there is a special place in hell for gatekeepers who don't share knowledge when they're in a position to do so, especially when it's not going to impact their business or their income, and it's probably going to help whoever's asking them.
I agree. And actually, thinking about that idea of gatekeepers made me think back again to your boss in the early days, who was not a gatekeeper at all, who shared their knowledge and thoughts with you about starting the blog, and look where that has led.
Precisely. And especially seeing as she was paying me to work for her, and she knew that, she was like, I know you don't want to work in beauty PR. Here is what you need to do.
I would like to ask you one final question. I wondered whether you might be able to recommend a book to me based on what you know about me, what you've read about me. If you could recommend something that you think I'd like to read.
Can you give me two books that you've loved, a genre that you hate, and do you want to feel inspired? Do you want some escapism? Do you want something thought-provoking? Those are the questions that I would need. So I'll sort of go through them one by one. How do you want the book that I recommend you to make you feel? Do you want it to be joyful and uplifting, thought-provoking, inspiring, or is there another word that springs to mind?
I think you said escapism earlier. I think that I'd go for that right now.
Escape. Um, two books that you've loved?
Um, I really loved Still Life by Sarah Winman.
Yeah.
And in a very different genre, I hugely enjoyed I enjoyed The Salt Path, but the follow-up, I can't remember what it's called.
Rain or Win. I
It's
can't
Rain or
remember.
Win, yeah.
Yeah, I've got it on my bookcase and I
It's
can't
the
remember what it's
second
called.
one in that. And I really did enjoy The Salt Path, but there was something about the second book where she's talking about what made the motivation for writing The Salt Path
Yeah.
that really connected with me. And I really like the kind of personal writing journey that was shared there. So I think they'd be two that come to mind quickly.
Okay. And what's the genre that you don't like?
I'm not mad about science fiction, although my husband told me it's called something else these days.
I mean,
Speculative fiction, apparently it's called.
I mean, that's a big no-no for me as well. Okay, so I'm going to recommend you two books. One for sort of the escapism, and one for the sort of personal narrative memoir,
Yeah.
similar to Raina Wynn. So escapism. Have you read Sandwich by Catherine Newman?
No.
Okay, favorite book of the year. It's set in a summer house in Massachusetts, in America. It is beautiful. It's sort of the ultimate. I was speaking to somebody else about it the other day, and I said, I really feel like summer houses in the States should be a genre in and of themselves. Like, just when you want that like real escapism, Catherine Newman is a sort of national treasure in America and the UK. And the only thing I would say, if you can, I don't usually say order it online and get the American book jacket, because the English one does not do it justice. We had the same book jacket in Australia as England, and I actually ordered two copies from the States because I just much preferred the American book jacket. So that's for the escapism one. And then one, probably one of my, well, it is one of my favorite memoirs, if not my all-time favorite memoir, and just absolutely beautiful example of how stunning like narrative nonfiction can be, is a book called Places I Stopped on the Way Home by Meg Lee. She's an American journalist. It's about the decade that she spent living in New York. And I think it's sort of subtitle is A Memoir of Chaos and Grace. And I just feel like every woman should read it. I think Meg Fee's writing is exquisite. And it's just a memoir that I recommend to everyone. So those would be my two recommendations for you.
Amazing. Thank you. I haven't heard of or read either of those, so I'm going to go and
Oh,
check them out
good.
after this interview is over. Lucy, thank you so, so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I really appreciate you sharing your such detailed and honest thoughts about life as a multi-hyphenate. And I will share lots of links to your work and
Amazing.
more information about you in the show notes. Thank you so much.
And I hope you love the two books.
That was Hannah Ash chatting to Lucy Pearson on the Creative Career Change podcast. You can find links to Lucy's website, her Substack and social media channels in the show notes, as well as several links to other things discussed in this interview. And if you enjoyed this episode and aren't already subscribed, visit shayhanny.substack.com to sign up and receive new episodes direct to your inbox.